Hi everyone, welcome back to the Farmland Drainage and the Environment Conference. We're happy that you've joined us today. Today we are hearing from Dr. Jill Blakely, and she's presenting on what makes an environment effect cumulative. So before I introduce Jill Blakely for us today, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge the numerous treaties across Saskatchewan. So we have treaty number 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. And Saskatchewan is the ancestral home of the Plains Cree, the Saulteaux, Nakota Assiniboine, Dakota, Lakota Sioux, and the Dene Siouxland people. Saskatchewan is also the home of the Métis Nation, and I just want to thank and acknowledge the diverse Indigenous peoples who have been on this land for many centuries here. So our virtual conference is brought to you by the Citizens Environmental Alliance and many like-minded organizations, and the goal is to raise awareness about wetland drainage in Saskatchewan and the different imperatives that surround this issue. So just a few housekeeping notes. Your mics are on mute. We'll be taking questions in the question box in the GoToWebinar dashboard, and we'll have a question period at the end of the presentation. If at any time you have a question, feel free to pop it in the question box and we'll get back to it at the end. So with that out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jill Blakely. So Jill Blakely holds a PhD in geography from the U of S, specializing in environmental assessment. And since 2009, she's been a faculty member of the Department of Geography and Planning and an associate of the School of Environment and Sustainability. Jill's academic and professional experience spans the area of environmental assessment, regional and urban planning, and natural resource management. In the past 15 years, Jill has published more than 70 academic papers, book chapters, and technical reports on environmental assessment topics, and she's provided expertise on strategic and cumulative effects assessments to many organizations. This includes Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, Transport Canada, Parks Canada, Alberta Environment, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and the Manitoba Clean Environment Commission. She is the lead editor for the forthcoming International Handbook of Cumulative Impact Assessments, which features work of more than 40 authors from 9 countries. So we're really happy to have you, Jill, and with that, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Lindsay. I also want to make my own land acknowledgement just before starting. The University of Saskatchewan Saskatoon campus is located and situated in Treaty 6 territory and also the homeland of the Métis. So we at the University of Saskatchewan reaffirm our relationship with the Indigenous peoples and ancestors of this place, and we look forward to working further on truth and reconciliation activities with all of you. So just before I get started, I guess I would like to maybe say a little bit about myself personally. And just that I'm from Saskatchewan. The grandparents of my parents came to Saskatchewan over 100 years ago, and they settled on farms near Waka Lake in Bruno and Humboldt area, and they have been farming and hunting and trapping in this area for all of that time. I did 2 of my degrees at the University of Saskatchewan. And so I come from a long line of people that, love the land, that are stewards of the land. And I grew up, heading to the farm every weekend and going trapping with my dad and uncles and so on. And so I think I can probably say for myself and most of us, at this conference this week is that we are stewards of the land. We see ourselves that way and we love the land. And so I'm really excited to be speaking to all of you. I haven't actually done a talk in Saskatchewan before about cumulative effects, so I'm excited for that. All right, so let's get started. So the talk is called What Makes an Environmental Effect Cumulative? And I'm going to talk to you just a little bit first about environmental change. Then we're going to look at cumulative effects, and then I'll talk to you about regional assessment. So first, let's just look at some recent environmental changes. Since the early 1900s, up to 70% of wetlands in the prairie region have been lost or degraded. Between 2000 and 2013, nearly 5% of Canada's intact forest landscape was lost or degraded, with 92% of this degradation occurring in areas containing species at risk. Plastic packaging exceeds 320 metric tons annually, of which 40% is used for single-use packaging, mostly in industrialized countries. But 95% of ocean plastic actually comes via 10 rivers, of which 8 are in Asia and 2 in Africa. 90 of 193 countries globally still do not have vehicle emission standards, and 80% of global diesel vehicles have higher emissions than certification limits would allow. So that's a lot of change, and that's just such a small overview of the changes that we are seeing globally over the last 100 years and recently. There have also been some major changes in the extent of Canada's grasslands over the past 130 years or so. In fact, losses of grasslands exceed those of other major biomes in North America. This map shows historical loss of grasslands up to the early 1990s. And you can see in the center of the map, tall grass prairie is now 99% lost. Prairie grasslands have suffered about a 70% loss up until the 1990s, or at the 1990s. So although most grassland loss in Canada occurred prior to the 1930s, largely as the result of conversion for cropland, grassland loss does still continue today, with small intact remnants often suffering the most or being under the most pressure. Since the 1970s in Canada, there has been an overall loss of 44% of the populations of grassland species, with individual species showing significant declines up to 87%. Humanity's impact on the Earth is now so profound that there is scientific agreement that we are now in the Anthropocene era, and that the Holocene era has come to a close. Scientists argue that the new epoch begins at about 1950, when we can see permanent change lodged in the geological record. So that change is defined by many phenomena, including the radioactive elements dispersed across the planet by nuclear bomb tests, but also an array of other signals, including plastic pollution, soot from power stations, concrete, and even the bones left by the global proliferation of the domestic chicken. So one of the hallmarks of the Anthropocene is accelerated change trends over the past 120 years, and that's what you see in the figure on this slide. The striking acceleration of population growth, carbon dioxide emissions, sea level rise, the global mass extinction of species, the transformation of land by deforestation and development, and so on, mark the end of the Holocene era. So how do we measure anthropogenic impacts? There are many ways, one of which is called the ecological footprint, and probably most of you have heard of that concept before. It's a calculable metric for demand on and supply of nature. So demand is defined as ecological assets that a given population requires in order to produce the natural resources it consumes and also to absorb its waste. Supply or biocapacity, on the other hand, is defined as the productivity of the population's ecological assets. And so what we want to see is ourselves remaining in an ecological reserve situation where biocapacity is greater than the demand, the total demand placed upon it. What we don't want is to see ourselves getting into an ecological deficit where anthropogenic impacts, change, demands exceed biocapacity. This is a global map of ecological footprint of consumption from 2014, and it's featured in a report, the Living Planet Report of 2018, but the map itself, the data in the map correspond to figures from 2014. Now, at that time, not so long ago, Canada's ecological footprint was one of the highest in the world. Okay, so the dark purple areas denote countries that have a high footprint. So Canada did have one of the highest footprints in the world at about 8.2 global hectares. Canada's biocapacity at that time did exceed the footprint. It was about 14.6 global hectares. So we might say to ourselves, great, we are in a situation of ecological reserve. We're doing well. However, the problem is that the gap is closing. And furthermore, it's the rate at which that gap is closing that is highly problematic and concerning. Another way to look at anthropogenic impact is through a metric called human access. Now, this metric estimates the combined land surface disturbance caused by anthropogenic industrial activities such as pipelines, roads, mines, forest clear cuts, and agricultural clearings. So according to this map, which was current to 2017, Canada has quite a large area given over to human access and industrial concessions. In fact, 25% of Canada's land mass, or 2.6 million kilometers squared, is covered by at least one industrial concession or land tenure. This includes 58 million hectares of mineral claims. And that is why when you look at Western Canada, particularly British Columbia and up into the Yukon, you see a lot of mid-tone gray, which is indicating many of those mineral claims. So let's look at some specific examples of anthropogenic impact over time nearby. Let's look at the Blueberry River First Nations territory in BC. This is a territory that covers more than 38,000 kilometers squared. Within that territory, which is depicted by the purple boundary line on the map, within that territory, you have situated approximately 20,000 oil and gas wells. You have more than 110,000 kilometers of roads, pipelines, transmission lines, and seismic lines. So many intersecting linear features. Over 70% of that landscape contains active petroleum and natural gas tenures, and less than 14% is covered by intact forests. Here's another example of human footprint, this time in Alberta, looking over a 100-year period. Okay, so this is an aggregate look at human footprint. And you can see in 1915, the purple is pretty minor. Mostly it's concentrated in the corridor that would stretch between Edmonton and Calgary, and a little bit to the northwest, more so in the Peace River region. By 1945, the purple human footprint had expanded considerably, as you can see, but perhaps most alarming is how much purple covers the province already by 2015. So by 2015, you can see that almost all of Alberta is subject now to human footprint. Another example is the changes that have happened to the Smith Creek watershed in terms of wetland loss due to anthropogenic impact or change. So here you see 3 maps comparing changes from 1958 on the left to 2000 in the middle, and then 2009 on the right. And the colors on the maps are a little bit flipped. So if you look at the 1958 map on the left, the red is actually denoting intact wetland, and the blue lines denote drainage projects or drainage areas. Okay, so by 2000, it seems like things are almost half and half. I'm not sure why my slides are advancing on their own. Anyway, in the middle, you see almost a half and half situation. And then you see to the right, you see that drainage and wetlands have almost flipped in terms of prominence. So the red wetland area has greatly receded and the drainage has greatly advanced. So what would you say are the most significant or top 5 environmental challenges globally or in Canada? I would probably list things like climate change, biodiversity loss, freshwater shortage, including loss of native prairies and wetlands, just as we talked about, soil depletion and so on. Probably most of the options you would come up with, or the problems, challenges you would come up with, could be termed cumulative effects issues. This slide shows you some examples of cumulative effects issues globally, and I compiled this list recently for a grant application, and it is now going to appear soon in an article. But what the list shows is the kinds of cumulative effects issues that are becoming top of mind for policymakers, for industry leaders, and for citizens all over the world, including Indigenous peoples. And of course, they include things like acid rain, light and noise pollution, nutrient depletion in soils. I've put wetland drainage, I've highlighted it in red because we're talking a bit about that today. It also includes many community and social cumulative effects like cultural erosion, language loss, and so on. Now, some of these issues do make it to the news, but many of them continue to fly under the radar from a regulatory and policy perspective. Why are cumulative effects issues so difficult to address? There are several reasons, and I'm going to briefly cover 5 of them. Okay, the first reason is that socio-ecological systems are really, really complex. So defining a socio-ecological system itself is a really difficult task. Where does it begin? Where does it end? What does it include? Even if we can define it, it is really complex to understand some of the external pressures that are weighing on that socio-ecological system. Perhaps there are global trends, global changes, global demands for certain resources. So all of these external pressures complicate our understanding of the system we're looking at. At the same time, the nature of the system itself, from the type of resource users that are in it, the relationships among them, the type of governance that is going on, the relationship of government to the people, to industry, the relationship of our social and economic system to the resource system and the environment, all of that is really complicated, and all of that exerts pressure as well, perhaps on neighboring socio-ecological ecosystems. So trying to find the beginning, the end, the relevant parties in a system makes it difficult to address cumulative effects issues. As well, change is incremental, but it also can be additive and even synergistic. So this map, or series of maps, shows you the Great Sandhills area in southwestern Saskatchewan. This area contains one of the largest sets of active sand dunes in Canada. Some of you, or many of you, might be really familiar with this area. It's a protected area and it lies within the Great Sandhills Ecological Reserve. However, over time, it has been encroached upon by both road development inside the reserve and gas well development surrounding the most sensitive parts of the ecological reserve. So again, there's a time series progression showing road encroachment from 1979 to 1991 to 2005. 1979, the black denotes current roads that were present in that area. 1991, the blue shows additional roads that were added within the reserve. And in 2005, you see the red, again, adding more roads to the existing roads in the reserve. And the large map shows a number of red squares or polygons superimposed upon the Great Sand Hills area. And those were environmentally assessed and approved areas for further gas well licensing. So you have pressures cumulatively, not just from one type of land use change, but from multiple kinds of land use changes. And those were just two. There were many other kinds of development pressures that were encroaching upon this area in this time. A third reason why it's so hard to address a lot of our global environmental challenges is because the changes are so very distanced in space and time. So many of the impacts are actually not immediate or concentrated like they might be in the event of, let's say, a 100-year flood or an oil spill. Those are direct, immediate, identifiable, and often easier to address for that reason. So unfortunately, many of our global environmental challenges result from gradual change, regional scale change that's hard for any one person to really perceive. Or they take place globally on a scale that really takes coordination among multiple countries in order to get a handle on. So these kinds of changes, these gradual changes, accumulate over long periods, even 100 years, 200 years or more. So those kinds of changes like soil degradation or habitat fragmentation aren't so immediate and obvious. And by the time they are obvious, they're pretty extensive and pretty hard to address. Okay, so the difference is that many of these challenges are created by non-point sources. Okay, so the sources of the change are scattered or diffuse, as opposed to coming from a specific point source that can be identified in space and time. Fourth, the global environmental challenges we face are really multidimensional. So not everybody agrees that there is in fact a problem. So what do you see in this picture? The picture that is on the screen can really represent many different perspectives, many different value sets, different understandings of science, and even different understandings of the environment. And that could be based upon personal experience of being on that land, personally stewarding that land over generations. Okay, so this in fact is an engineered wetland that you're looking at, and it was constructed to replace a series of connected natural wetlands just off of Slimmen Road here in Saskatoon. So some might look at that engineered wetland and value it and perceive it as a useful recreational area perhaps. Perhaps they see it as good for their property value if they purchased a building lot nearby. And in fact, a lot of Saskatoon's newest neighborhoods are built around natural wetland complexes that are then altered. Of course, the engineered wetland does provide important flood control service, but it is only of limited ecological value if we do compare it to the ecological value that would have been engendered in the natural wetland complex. So should we replace wetlands with engineered wetlands? That would depend. It would depend on your values, it depends on your perspectives, depends upon the environmental management objectives set for that area. Maybe it depends upon the city's objectives for developing that land, and so on and so forth. Finally, there is a psychological element that confounds our ability to address global environmental change. And this has been termed the tragedy of the commons. Again, probably most of you have heard of this concept. Basically, it refers to a phenomenon when individuals neglect the well-being of society or an ecosystem in pursuit of personal economic gain. This phenomenon was first written about in the early 1800s by William Forster Lloyd, who was a British writer on economics. And he noticed that common pastures tended to fare worse over time than privately owned and managed pastures. So why was that? Basically because each shepherd or each owner of cows was incentivized to add more cows to their herd to maximize their short-term economic gain and at speed. So in other words, there was a bit of a pressure to hurry up and add another cow to your own herd in order to get the grass, in order to fatten it up, in order to gain more profits before your neighbor did the same thing in the common pasture. So this phenomenon leads to overconsumption and ultimately depletion of the common resource to everybody's detriment. In this cartoon, we see a couple of fishermen looking over the side of a boat and saying to each other, well, there it is, the last fish in the ocean. Woohoo! At least we beat the Russians and the Spaniards to it. So the joke being that really the tragedy of the commons is the exact same phenomenon that caused or contributed to, let's not say caused, but definitely contributed to the collapse of the cod fishery at the Grand Banks of Newfoundland in the 1990s. And as all Canadians know, that fishery still hasn't recovered. That common resource was depleted to a point that it could not recover itself. So now let's look at specifically what makes an environmental effect cumulative. So there are differing legal, policy-based, and scientific definitions for what makes an effect cumulative. Federally, the Impact Assessment Act of 2019 provides the following definition. Impact assessment of a designated project must take into account any cumulative effects that are likely to result from the designated project in combination with other physical activities that have been or will be carried out. And that's a definition provided in section 22(1)(a)(2). Now, a policy definition that was developed in Canada by the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment in 2014 reads as follows. Cumulative effect is a change in the environment caused by multiple interactions among natural processes that accumulate across space and time. And I've added emphasis to both of those definitions by bolding the text. And I did that because I'm trying to highlight for you that what makes an effect cumulative is this idea of a combination of activities, okay, multiple interactions. And those can be activities of the same kind, okay, of a similar kind, or they can be activities or interactions of differing kinds. So coming from different kinds of activities, different kinds of perturbations. But the point is that there's a combination, there is multiple interactions over time that accumulates across space and time. So if we look to the peer-reviewed literature for a definition of cumulative effects, there are many definitions, many kinds of effects that have been talked about over the past 50 plus years since cumulative effects assessment was formally introduced in the United States through the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. So one of my graduate students, Brianna Sikorsky, recently completed her master's thesis in 2018. And as part of that work, she went through the scientific peer-reviewed literature to look at, how cumulative effects were defined. And she found more than 40 different types of cumulative effects were discussed. Okay, in practice, most of these types of effects are not discussed commonly, but I've circled the two that do get discussed or assessed quite commonly in an environmental impact assessment situation. That is, those are additive and incremental. Okay, so arguably a few other of them also get some attention, such as synergistic, linear, multiplicative, compounding, and so on. Okay, but however it is you define cumulative environmental effects, the most important thing to know about the concept is why we would do it, why we would spend time trying to understand and assess cumulative impact. Okay, so I've put that for you on this slide in red. The benefit of assessing the total cumulative impact on valued components or aspects of the environment is to inform decision-making about the relative impact of adding one more project. So if we do not understand the cumulative impact and what it means, we really don't have a basis, we don't have a framework, we don't have any grounds on which to make a judgment about the relative merits or demerits of adding yet another project in that system, in that socio-ecological system. Okay, and it's really important to know that the law, so our legislation, our regulations, those typically only apply to a very few projects, a very few development projects. Ultimately, the majority of development projects that contribute to cumulative change over time go completely unnoticed, completely unchecked by laws and regulations. And it's for that reason that people are shifting to a form of assessment called regional assessment, because they want to try to do their own work to capture and assess cumulative impact to the environment in their area or in their region. So since the year 2000, more than 52 initiatives in Canada have been completed. So 52 regional assessment initiatives in Canada have been completed. And this is just the ones that my research team could find. There are very likely more initiatives than that, and there are definitely many more internationally. So I know you won't be able to see the text on the next two slides very easily, but I put them there just to show you that the information and the data exist. If you're interested in it, you could contact me at a later time and I can share it more easily with you. But the point is to show you that British Columbia, the first province that's featured in the table, British Columbia has completed 17 regional assessments since 2000, more are underway. Alberta has completed at least 6. In Saskatchewan, there was 1 that was completed for the Great Sandhills Regional Environmental Study, and that's where those figures and maps came from that I showed you earlier. That was done in about 2007. Okay, and so on and so forth. If we look to the rest of Canada on the next slide, we see that in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador, 11 regional assessments have been completed. And in total, in the Canadian North and the Canadian Arctic, 12 regional impact assessments have been completed. So I show this to you because people realize now that understanding cumulative impacts is really best done on a regional scale. It really just isn't possible to do it well within the scope of considering a single project or a single land use change. Okay, so people are doing this voluntarily. In fact, nearly half of the initiatives featured on these two slides are voluntarily undertaken by different groups And when I say that, I mean it's spearheaded by groups other than, well, outside of being required to on a legislative or regulatory basis. Okay, so nearly all of the initiatives that I've showed you on both of these slides have cumulative effects assessment as a central focus to the work. More than half of the initiatives in Canada that I've discovered are focused on multi-sectoral land use planning. None of them has seemed to originate from the agriculture sector so far, except for a couple that are coming from the aquaculture sector in British Columbia. However, there are many initiatives that are taking place as a combined effort between industry, government, scientists, public interest groups, and so on and so forth. So quite certainly, agricultural stakeholders are participating in some of these initiatives. I'm just saying that so far, I don't see one that is primarily focused on or led by agriculture. Now, what is the importance of all of this to agrologists? Well, you know much better than me, what agrologists do in their work, what they care about, what their values are. But I did see that they are professionals who are committed to being guardians of the food system and innovators in the economy, but also they are committed to being stewards of the environment. So agrologists and agricultural technologists provide leadership in environmental sustainability through their efforts in conservation, wetland protection, land management techniques, and renewable resource management. So I think that it is, well within the realm of consideration, the realm of practice, the realm of innovation, the realm of consideration for agrologists to think more deeply about cumulative effects, the cumulative effects of agriculture, and what has taken place over time, and what this all means to us today, and what it could mean in the future. So in my, I will admit, limited understanding of agrology, but I guess based on what I know about cumulative effects and what I see in the research and what I see in practice across Canada, I do think that there are a lot of great foundational elements that do already exist and could feed into a regional assessment of the impacts of wetland drainage. So if we just were to take a simple DPSIR framework, which stands for Driver Pressure State Impact Response Framework, we see that we know a lot of this information already. So in terms of drivers, we understand underlying causal forces. We understand the historical settlement patterns in Saskatchewan. We understand our social customs and beliefs here as stewards of farmland, of prairie grasslands. We understand our development trajectories, our economic pressures and incentives. And we understand how all of that has resulted in certain kinds of strains upon the environment or pressures on the environment. So we understand that there has been widespread diversion of water, there has been widespread drainage of wetlands, and so on and so forth. We also have the science now to understand the state changes in some of our most important environmental indicators or components. So we understand that there have been changes in quality and quantity of metrics like soil oxygen concentrations. Okay, so we have a lot of that science and that understanding now. What we might want to do collectively as a group is spend more time reflecting on the impacts of all of this. Okay, so what does this really mean in terms of habitat loss, wildlife habitat loss, in terms of release of stored carbon and nutrients? What does it mean to our society? Can we sustain this rate of change? Are there things we might need to reconsider, do differently? Okay, and we might want to consider what our response is to all of this. Have we made an appropriate response? Is the response effective enough? Okay, do we need to think about how to coordinate our attempts to manage, mitigate, and strategically avoid some of these cumulative impacts? So I guess what I want to leave you with before I, point you to some additional resources, I just want to leave you with a question. And the question is there an opportunity for an agrologist-led regional assessment of the cumulative effects of wetland drainage in Saskatchewan? Okay, is there an opportunity here? What might be the benefits of doing that? Okay, how could it help us in the work we do? And I really like this quote that comes from an organization here in Saskatchewan called Conservation of Change. And the quote is as follows: "Are trade-offs inevitable, or can the challenges of balancing wetlands and agriculture be managed for the mutual benefit of all?" And why I like that quote is I really firmly believe that the days of the dichotomous debate, are over. The us against them, I'm right, you must be wrong. It is industry or environment. To me, those days are long over, and we are now in an age, the Anthropocene age, where we all have to acknowledge our collective goals, our collective needs as a society, our collective need for a vital economy, but also our collective need for a functioning environment and for ecosystems that do provide the ecosystem services on which we all depend. And it is really no shame to ask ourselves, what could we possibly change about what we're doing now or what we've done historically that could provide us benefits in the future? Many people think that is a question worth asking, and that is evidenced by the great number of regional assessment initiatives that do exist now in Canada. And those initiatives are just exploding, the more and more as time goes on. So just before I close, I want to point you to a couple of additional resources. If you haven't already seen the documentary Wetland, Wasteland, I would suggest that you do. It's great. It was released in 2019. It was made by a colleague of mine, Phil Loring. He's an anthropologist. And he made the film with Donald Selby, who is a talented filmmaker. And essentially, they are taking a look at the relationship between wetlands and agricultural development over time, and trying to find that common ground in conversation. Another opportunity for you to learn more or to talk more is coming up soon on January 29th. The School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan is putting on a talk that's open to the public as far as I know. I'm quite sure it's public. All are welcome. It's at 1:30 p.m. and the topic is balancing food and water security. So it's about the future of Saskatchewan's irrigation activities, and it's highly relevant to probably everybody who's watching this presentation. So I believe they're going to have 3 different speakers, and then probably some questions and answers moderated by the director for the Global Institute for Water Security, Dr. Jay Famiglietti. So if you want to know more, for more information, I provided an email address for you right there at the bottom on the right. And that's everything that I have for you in terms of slides, and I'd be happy to take questions or any type of discussion. And again, I'm really grateful for your attention and for the opportunity. All right, take care.
Great, thank you so much, Jill, for that great presentation. It's very thorough in terms of understanding what makes an effect cumulative, how to go about doing a regional assessment, and all of that. The first question I think that maybe we can start with here is that wetland drainage, of course, is a very complex issue, and there's a question here about how wetland drainage or wetland loss would be considered within cumulative effect. So you mentioned that there was lots of different classifications, whether that was linear, synergistic, cumulative. There's many more there. So there's two-part question here. Is first off, do you know if there's any studies that look at the individual components of wetland loss, so whether that's water quality impacts, habitat loss impacts, and whether those individual components would be considered cumulative effects? That's the first part. And then when you look at wetland drainage as a whole, with all of these different facets, how do they all come together? So if certain things are cumulative or not. Do you get my question here? It's a little complex there.
I kind of didn't, to be honest. It's a little bit complex. Could you just start with part A and just simplify it slightly? What are your, the question is, do I know of a study that looks at cumulative impacts on different components of a wetland? Is that what you're saying?
So the part A is wetland loss and wetland drainage. What would it be considered when you look at cumulative effects? So in terms of linear, compound effects, and do you know of any studies out there looking at that?
Okay, so that would be impossible to just define like right here and now. You would have to take a look at what all the different pressures are on that particular piece of land. And even if we're looking at it as a single piece of land, you would have to look at it in the context of other changes that have or haven't happened in that area. And you not only have to look at it in terms of what presently is affecting that area, you would have to know something about historical changes, and you would also want to incorporate anything you know about potential future changes. So in order to be able to put a label to that change, you would have to do that work. You would not be able, like I would not, it would be not possible for me to just sort of sit here and then give it a label or say what kind of a cumulative effect it might be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then the second part of that question is, when you have these different dynamics when you look at the different dynamics of wetland drainage, so whether that's habitat loss, hydrology, water quality, how if these individual components, so the question is whether these individual components can be considered cumulative, and what does that mean when you have individual components considered cumulative or not, when they come together to look at the big picture of wetland drainage? How does that work?
Okay, so how it works, you actually would try to identify the components of the environment that you're trying to protect first, and that's how you would sort of structure the assessment. You would figure out, it would be a combination of, I guess, conversations among the stakeholders that are doing that assessment, but also conversations with scientists who might understand that ecosystem, also Indigenous knowledge holders in that area. And together you would come up with sort of an agreed upon number of environmental components that you think are important to protect. So whether that is a certain endangered polygon of wildlife habitat, or whether that is a particular wildlife species itself. Maybe it is a rare a kind of fescue. So you would have these focal points, or maybe it's an ecosystem function. So maybe you're trying to protect the ability of the wetland to provide provisioning services, okay, primary productivity services, food and sustenance. So you would figure out what you're focusing on, and then you would assess how all of these different changes might cumulatively come to bear upon the components of interest. So you would try to figure out, you know, the state of those components historically, now, and potentially in the future, and how the collective or total impact or change might alter their ability to survive or to persist.
Okay, thank you. We have a few questions here about the policy component in terms of how to incorporate cumulative effects into our policy and in how policymakers can mitigate or be aware of this. So one question here is regarding whether environmental assessments can only be done on Crown land, or if they can be done on privately owned agricultural land, and whether that would be something done by the government, or if this would be have to be done by the owner themselves.
So the Federal Impact Assessment Act applies to lands that are owned or funded by or managed by the federal government. So the Federal Impact Assessment Act applies really to only a very few projects, very few projects. In fact, the legislation changed in 2012 to be more of an exclusion list, an inclusion list rather than an exclusion list. I'm not sure if I have that quite right, but the point is that when we first had a Federal Impact Assessment Act, it covered everything, all major projects except those that were on an exclusion list, and then in 2012 that flipped. So now it only applies to a few projects that are specifically included, and it results in only, I think it's a few dozen impact assessments federally per year, and only done for the most controversial or potentially negatively impactful kinds of projects in Canada. So the Federal Act and even provincial acts don't apply to private land. Now, that doesn't mean private landowners can't get involved or aren't involved in some of those processes, but impact assessment is something that, sure, it can be done by anyone. It can be done outside the regulatory context if people take an initiative to do that. But that would be a separate process. It would be a non-regulatory process.
Okay. Thank you. Our next question here is about if you want to elaborate on the major challenges in attaining the goals relating to regional assessments. So once if a regional assessment has been done and we have goals, put in place, just recognizing that people have competing demands and municipalities have their own objectives. Do you want to comment or elaborate on, if a regional assessment is done, how to move forward with these new goals, considering the complexity of maybe those social economic contributors?
Okay, so what I hear from my colleagues who are implementing regional assessments across Canada, one of the biggest challenges with that is the coordination that would happen after the regional assessment. So let's say that you do the regional assessment. Let's say you can understand what the cumulative impacts are to certain valued components of interest. You have a good understanding of maybe what needs to change in terms of stopping certain activities, starting other activities, mitigation plans, management plans, and all of that. Let's just say you've completed the assessment and it's all in place. What I hear from my colleagues, it's the afterwards part that is the biggest challenge, because making any change requires coordination and communication among a lot of people, over time, and sustained communication. And that really is one of the primary challenges that I hear about, and that we have written about, sort of what happens after the assessment. And part of the issue, and this is not our fault, this is not anyone's fault, it's just that over time, like in environmental management all through the 20th century, and even now, our different government bodies and government departments and agencies, they're set up in silos, to take care of specific elements, and they're not built as integrative units. And so sharing information across, establishing communication channels across, is difficult. But again, that's okay. People are resolving those problems. People are moving to, let's say, local or regional advisory boards that can help facilitate that cross-sectional communication. And then it's a matter of communicating, to individual, let's say, landowners or project developers, and developing good faith working relationships, and letting people do as much as they can do towards supporting the goals of that assessment.
Thank you. All right. Our next question here is whether or not wetland projects, I'm assuming here specifically wetland drainage projects, should be held to the same standard of an environmental impact assessment as is required by more industrial projects. And if so, how would you propose this to be done?
Okay, well, that's kind of a complicated question. Like, should it be held to a higher standard than, an industrial project or something else? Because you're kind of comparing apples and oranges in a way. Should it be held to the same standard? Okay, well, I think the question is really like, there's a different question here. And the question is, again, if we understand collectively that part of the environment can no longer tolerate any more additional stress, then it is incumbent upon all of us, in whatever role we have, to influence the environment, to make the changes we can make in order to alleviate some of that stress. So, there are, like in Saskatchewan, there are standards and regulations for wetland drainage projects. The problem is that most of the projects do not, get treated in that system, and they are unlicensed. So, it's sort of a complicated question. I think we all have to work to hold ourselves to the highest standards that we can as stewards of the land. And I know that's how you all regard yourselves. That's how I regard myself. And I hope that helps a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Well, and we also have a comment here just about the current policy for agriculture drainage, and looking for just how the portions of the act that protects the environment and society is perhaps not being imposed on the applicants for drainage projects. So we are seeing comments like that come through in our discussion period here. Sorry, just give me 1 second here. We have lots of great questions, you guys. It's obviously a very complex issue, and lots of things are coming in, and that's really wonderful. All right. Sorry. Maybe, do you want to just, we can maybe land here. So what influence does land and water carrying capacity in an area have when looking at the impact of a cumulative effect? So just kind of looking at this carrying capacity that we have, and how that comes together with whether impacts are cumulative or not.
Okay, could you just say that one more time? I didn't quite understand the first part.
So what influence does land and water carrying capacity have on cumulative impacts? Let me maybe expand on that a little bit if I understand the question correctly. So just given that certain impacts are cumulative, how important is it to understand just the carrying capacity that we have in Saskatchewan, and looking at how all these different facets may have cumulative effects that may not be just linear additive? How important is it to understand the carrying capacity of what we actually have in our province?
Well, it is a good place to kind of land and end the session because it could not be more critically important to understand that. We have got to understand our carrying capacity, both land and water wise. We have to, because we need to know how close we are to exceeding limits, limits at which our land and water ecosystems may, after which when those limits are crossed, those systems collapse and we can't get them back. Whether that is, I'm sure agrologists understand the concept of avoiding soil depletion. We really don't want that. We don't want it to get to that level. So we have to look at regenerative agricultural strategies, right? And the same with water. There can be a point at which the rivers will die and they will not be able to sustain life. And so, that's happened in all kinds of rivers globally. So understanding our carrying capacities and our limits, it's a tough ask to find out what those are, but it's critical. It's completely critical. That's the only way that we really can judge whether or not we have the additional capacity for more change, for more cumulative impact. So hopefully that helps as well.
Definitely does. And thank you so much for your presentation today. I think you've given us lots to think about in terms of the bigger picture about these dynamics that aren't necessarily straightforward, but they are important to understand and to consider moving forward. And, wetland drainage is a very complex issue, and you've added another layer of complexity to it, but I think it's good to understand and it's good to take that into consideration. Absolutely. So sorry, go for it.
Oh, I just want to say, I just wanted to say you are right. Like it's highly, highly complex, but unfortunately that's our reality now and we cannot shy away from it. We cannot put our heads in the sand any longer. We have to continue to try to deal with these complex issues.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to wrap things up today and thank everyone for joining us for our webinar series. We've heard from a lot of great speakers, and including you, Jill. So thank you so much. And I just want to, of course, take this moment just to thank our partners who made this conference possible, adapting to the current situation as hosting a virtual conference. So thank you to all of our partners. That includes Colleen Lakes Eco Museum, the Citizens Environmental Alliance, Ducks Unlimited Canada, Last Mountain Lake Stewardship Group, the Lower Capel Watershed Stewards, Nature Saskatchewan, PPPI, Saskatchewan Environmental Society, Sierra Club Canada Foundation, SAWS, and Saskatoon Wildlife Federation. So thank you everyone for joining us today and throughout our 2 weeks of presentations. Hope you have a good one and take care.